Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about The Bough Breaks, the second play of the This Restless House trilogy by Zinnie Harris. So the trilogy, This Restless House, is an adaptation of Aeschylus's Oresteia, and The Bough Breaks is an adaptation of the middle play of that trilogy, The Libation Bearers. But Harris makes some really important and interesting changes. So, as with Agamemnon's Return, the first play of Harris's trilogy, this is a much more psychologically complex play than what we get in Aeschylus. The characters have a lot more depth, a lot more complexity. There's really interesting internal conflicts and contradictions and things like this. And so in that sense, it's really a very interesting adaptation, a very modernizing adaptation. So one of the big changes right off the bat is that Electra is not consumed with desire for revenge against Clytemnestra and Aegisthus. She doesn't really care for Aegisthus, which seems perfectly reasonable because he's pretty much a dick throughout the whole play. I mean, he is very controlling. He's very suspicious of Electra, even when all she wants to do is be near her mother and things like this. And Clytemnestra is not resentful of Electra. So the first 2/3 or so of the play, they actually have a fairly positive, supportive relationship, which is completely different from Aeschylus's version, and actually also from Sophocles and Euripides' versions, where right from the beginning of the play, Electra's dominant emotional state is the desire for revenge against Clytemnestra, and Clytemnestra distrusts her, hates her, fears her, etc., etc. So, right from the beginning, we've got a very different dynamic. In this case, because Electra is not that devoted to Agamemnon. And so that's a huge change. At the beginning of The Bough Breaks, Clytemnestra is actually in some sort of coma. She's in a deep sleep and no one can figure out how to get her out of it. But then Electra goes and she prays to the spirit of her father at his unmarked grave with the murderers and thieves and whatever it is. She says, Dad, I guess I don't understand you and I don't understand her, but could you be calmer? Let go a bit. Do something about your anger. There must be better things to do over there. Fun things, new things. Can't you go and do some of those? You were loved, I think. You were loved even. Or you are loved even. There's nothing to be gained by taking her too. I need her here. I need her to be well here, because if I don't have her... So leave her now, please, and let her wake up. That's what I came to say, Dad. Really, that's all. I lost my sister. I lost you. I don't want to lose my mom as well. So nobody can figure out how to wake Clytemnestra from this sleep. Electra believes that she's haunted by the ghost of Agamemnon, so she goes and she makes this prayer asking him basically to have pity on both Clytemnestra and Electra, and at that moment Clytemnestra awakens. Like, almost the next thing that occurs is that Electra hears the bell tolling from the castle, signifying that Clytemnestra has awoken. But this awakening is not necessarily all that might have been hoped for. Clytemnestra becomes obsessed with this idea that she's plagued by flies and that she's actually rotting from the inside. Her breath becomes terrible. She finds flies in her food. She sees flies on her body. She feels flies on her body, even when others can't see them. So this is one of the interesting ambiguities of Harris's play is whether or not this affliction that Clytemnestra experiences is objectively real or whether this is a delusion. But she becomes obsessed with the idea of flies. Flies trying to eat her rotting flesh. And I'm going to talk more about the flies in a minute because that's a significant symbol. So she comes back to basically this sort of miserable existence, and Electra goes back to Agamemnon's grave to try and sort of plead with his spirit not to punish her in this way, not to punish Clytemnestra in this way. And there she meets a man. And we get a variation of the famous recognition scene in Aeschylus's The Libation Bearers. And this is actually a recognition scene that Euripides sort of satirizes in his Electra play. But I will at some point get to Euripides' Electra play. But the stage directions say she pulls down her cloak. Electra says, "We have the same hair, the same complexion." The man says, "It's common around here." Electra says, "We have the same eyes, the same hands." And so we get this recognition scene, because in Aeschylus, what happens is that Euripides leaves a lock of his hair on Agamemnon's tomb, and Electra, when she comes to the tomb to pour libations, sees the hair and is like, "Hey, that's exactly the same kind of hair as me. Orestes is back." So we have this recognition scene, and it is bizarre because it does sort of stand out in this otherwise much more psychologically dynamic and realistic play, that we have this Aeschylean recognition scene where Electra says, "You have the same hair and eyes and skin and hands as me." Like, it doesn't make that much sense. Like, I mean, I have a sister. We look similar, but not necessarily similar enough that, like, if we hadn't seen each other... I mean, like, if we hadn't seen each other since we were babies, basically, or since we were young children, and then we met as adults, it's unlikely we'd be like, "We have the same hair and face and hands. We're probably related." Like, that's just, it's not how things really work. As a sibling, I can tell you that's not how things really work. So it is this weird bit where we get just this sort of throwback to Aeschylus as this sort of odd detour out of the otherwise sort of complex and interesting psychology of the play. But the meeting with Orestes is really significant because this is the first time that Electra starts thinking about taking revenge for Agamemnon in this play. There's no indication prior to this that that's even on her radar. But Orestes is thinking about it because he thinks that he is also being punished by Agamemnon's ghost. So for him it started out with itchy feet. And then the itching spread. And so that, I mean, that you can say, okay. And Electra, we learn a little bit later, also experiences itching. So that you can say, okay, well, they inherited that from their dad, because Orestes tells us that Agamemnon he actually says he was always itchy. He had these scabs on his feet. It used to drive him crazy. So we've got this component of itching. And you could say, fine, that's just genetic, whatever. Agamemnon had some sort of skin condition that he passed down to his children. And actually, Electra makes that argument. She says, "I think you're making too much of this. So we are his children. We have an affliction, and it follows that we would." But what that doesn't explain is the other physiological changes these two children of Agamemnon undergo. Even though neither of them had their appendix out, they both have an appendectomy scar in the same place that Agamemnon had his. And Orestes, who's sort of further along in this process, is starting to show signs of tattoos on his inner arms where Agamemnon had tattoos, even though Orestes has never gotten a tattoo. So Orestes asserts that he is turning into Agamemnon, and it becomes this idea with them, with Orestes and then with Electra, that in some sense the spirit of Agamemnon is working through them to take revenge. And so that becomes the sort of driving force of the last portion of the play, is this idea of the children taking revenge to appease their father's restless spirit. And they actually end up doing this. So Electra remains at least partially convinced that that Clytemnestra is fundamentally good, that she's not deserving of matricide. So they decide to set a test for her where Electra will report that Orestes has died, and they're going to see how she reacts. If she reacts with joy, that will be confirmation that she doesn't have maternal feelings, and therefore she should be killed in revenge for Agamemnon. If she reacts with sorrow, that would be an indication that she's not all that bad and she deserves to be spared. So this is the plan. When Electra first reports this to Clytemnestra, her first impulse is actually sorrow. She is saddened by the loss of her son. But she quickly realizes that her physiological symptoms, the bad breath, the feeling of rotting from the inside, etc., etc., those things disappear immediately. And she celebrates. And this seals her fate. Orestes and Electra. Orestes is sort of hidden behind a curtain, so he hears this. But Orestes actually becomes less sure about this murder, and Electra becomes more sure. And she's especially convinced. And this is an interesting moment, because Clytemnestra and Aegisthus go off to have sex, which they haven't done for a long time, because they were having relationship problems, and then because Clytemnestra felt like she was rotting from the inside, which is not really the sexiest mood, I imagine. So they go off to have sex now that she's feeling chipper again. And Electra tells Orestes that through the door, she could hear them as they were walking down the corridor, and Aegisthus tells Clytemnestra that the letter was fake. The letter saying that Orestes had died was fake, and that he doesn't believe Orestes is dead. And what Electra claims that she hears is, she said the thing that damns her most of all. She said, find him then and kill him. She said, find him then and kill him. Kill my son. Now, this is interesting because it's accurate to the Clytemnestra of Aeschylus's play, who does seem to want Orestes dead. But here we only have Electra's word for it, and by this point in the play, Electra is set on killing Clytemnestra. And so we do have to wonder whether or not Clytemnestra actually says this, or whether Electra just claims she says this as a way of convincing Orestes to go through with it. And this uncertainty is sort of reinforced because Clytemnestra comes back into the kitchen. Orestes goes to kill her, but he's unable to. He's unable to plunge the knife into her. He actually drops it because he can't go through with it. And Electra picks up the knife and stabs Clytemnestra, who falls to the ground. Electra tells Orestes to finish her, and he can't. So Electra has to stab Clytemnestra again to actually kill her. Though when Aegisthus comes in to investigate what the screaming is about, Orestes does actually kill him. He breaks his neck, and so Orestes does have some blood on his hands. But I want to come back to a couple of significant images or themes here. One is the flies, and the other is the itching. And these are, I think, related, but they're definitely significant. So the flies that Clytemnestra experiences, for me, I think this is almost certainly a reference to Jean-Paul Sartre's play, which in English is called The Flies, which is an Electra adaptation. So in that play, when Orestes comes back to Argos, he finds that the city is infested with flies, and it's representative of the moral decay of the citizens who have dedicated themselves to mourning the death of Agamemnon without actually doing anything to take revenge. And so the flies there are a symbol of sort of moral putrefaction, internal putrefaction, in exactly the same way that Clytemnestra in Harris's play believes that she's rotting from the inside and the flies are coming to feast on her decaying flesh. The flies in Sartre are also connected to the Furies, who are similar in that they are dark, flying, swarming creatures that come to punish the fly. I mean, the flies aren't necessarily punishing, but the flies are definitely drawn by moral decay. The Furies have come to punish matricide. So we have those links there. The other thing is the itching, and this is maybe a more tenuous link, but it's something that makes sense to me. In the biblical figure of Herod the Great dies from an unknown disease. One of the symptoms is itching, intense itching, along with bad breath, and maggots or worms in his genitals. So I want to tie a couple of these things together. So we've got Orestes and Electra, who become intensely itchy. We know from Orestes' report that Agamemnon had intense itching and actually had scabs on his feet, scabs on his back from where he had scratched himself up. And one of the theories about what killed Herod is that he had kidney failure, or some sort of prolonged kidney disease, which created itching, and the itching led to scratching, which could have introduced bacteria. And so, in scratching around his genitals, he introduced bacteria, which festered, leading to gangrene, and maggots grew in the gangrenous flesh. Another theory is arteriosclerosis, or hardening of the arteries, which similarly can lead to severe itching as well as dead tissue. But one of the things that I think is significant there is the idea of the maggots, because Clytemnestra at one point expresses this intense fear. I can feel them. There are things crawling across my skin, eating the rot. I'm worried they're laying their eggs there, that there will be maggots soon in my skin, and then the maggots will turn into adults, and I will have 100 flies on my back. So we've got this intense anxiety about maggots consuming rotting flesh. We've got this theme of itching and scratching up the skin. And so there is this sort of, I think there's this sort of link to the divine justice that was supposedly visited upon Herod, along with the sort of Sartrean themes of moral decay, bad faith, existential freedom, and so on, that get manifest in the plague of flies and this feeling of internal decay.